Hello, you're very welcome to If I Were the Minister for Education, a regular podcast where I delve into the world of Irish primary education and let you know what I would do if I were the Minister for Education. This is Simon Lewis. On this week's show, I am going to be exploring the further collapse of special education in our system. I'm going to be asking whether we should be re-examining bus transport rather than expanding it. And I'll also be wondering why schools are to blame for granting Irish exemptions when it was the Department of Education who made the rules up in the first place. If you are interested in subscribing to this podcast, you can do so on your favorite podcasting platform, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any of the rest of them. And you can also watch this live on YouTube, where I have been broadcasting for the last while. Let us start very straight away in special education because as you may or may not be aware, the set allocations fiasco, the cluster games are still on the agenda, with schools still struggling to make up full-time posts from the fractions of posts they were given, the cuts to many schools who weren't expecting them, the cut to complex needs, which Inclusion Ireland, as I am, and Down Syndrome Ireland managed to get a meeting with Josepha Madigan. And not only that, lobby groups such as the National Principals Forum, of which I'm part of, have gathered a huge amount of data which state that nobody on the ground is happy at all. So neither parents nor teachers nor the pupils are happy about the special allocations that were doled out for this coming September. And yet the representative bodies have said not a word, and the Department of Education are essentially making a blatant spin doctoring, blatantly false claims about the system. And the biggest stat I can probably say, that there's lots and lots of big stats, but the big stat that the National Principals Forum basically found was 76% of school principals do not believe that the allocation fulfilled the needs of the pupils within their schools. And that is a big stat. So I guess the question I always ask really is, could it's Principal Skinner from The Simpsons? Could the children be? I can't remember. I'm paraphrasing here, but he's pondering in his office. Do you know? Could it be that I'm wrong, or is it the children that are wrong? No, nonsense. It's clearly everybody else is wrong. I can't be wrong, kind of thing. So essentially, I'm saying to the Department, could the principals on the ground, could 76% of principals be completely wrong on this? I don't think so. We really need this to be sorted. I think the story is going to rumble on as special education continues to collapse, since it has been doing so since 2008, when cuts were made to services for children from traveller communities, cuts to EAL, which have now become special education issues because the services to students with EAL weren't recovered, and we have children who are struggling with the use of English language, plus other needs, maybe not exactly always resulting from the lack of English education, English as an additional language education. But it's unbelievable to see how things have fallen. We continue on in 2012, the 15% cross cuts to special education hours, the better, fairer way of 2017, where 91% of schools would have been better off with the old system compared to the change that happened in 2017. Keeping going as developing schools were hardest hit. Children were not additional hours weren't being given to children. The schools are given an algorithm, and in 2024, for whatever reason, we are now relying on very small amount of data to dole out allocations, and the algorithm is nonsense. And we have proved this time and time again over the last couple of months and over the last few years, really. And yet the Department of Education continue to dig their heels in, saying that what they are doing is correct and the children are being supported. And their big sale item now is that because class sizes are smaller, obviously teachers can deal with the needs themselves. And yet they're trying to get a fully inclusive model. Under the radar this week, I found myself on the media talking about this a little bit based on an article that came along from the Journal. And the Journal basically approached me after someone in NEPS contacted this journalist. And sorry, I need to find out the name of the journalist here because I've forgotten it. It's Owen Dalton here. And Owen Dalton was approached, I don't know whether it was a friend or anyway, it was a NEPS psychologist who basically said NEPS is falling apart. The psychologist said to Owen that their service is unaccountable and said that they cannot fill a lot of their positions are 20% down. And Owen rang me because he said, I see a bit on the online talking about special education. Is what I'm hearing true? So I asked him to explain what he meant by unaccountable, because for me, that's a very loaded word. And clearly, I'm now quoted as saying they're unaccountable. But this is what they're unaccountable for. When a NEP psychologist comes into the school, I think this is the thing that really shocked Owen more than anybody else, and lots of people, and actually on the radio, most journalists, is that NEPS doesn't operate a waiting list. Okay, and this is what they mean by unaccountable. Essentially, what happens is a NEP psychologist comes into a school, if you're lucky enough to have a NEP psychologist. So this is when you have a NEP psychologist. Lots of schools do not have access to NEPs, by the way. And they ask you to prioritize your highest need that year, and then NEPs will have a look at those. Children that do not get onto the priority list are not on a waiting list. There is no waiting list. So that looks like, on paper, that NEPs fulfills all the needs that schools bring to them. But it's the stuff that happens before that. I think that's where the unaccountable means. So essentially what you're being asked to do, and this is I just hate this statement. And it seems to be like this kind of thing that's used all the time by all the different services. The NCSE will have said, actually I had an NCSE meeting, and in the whole meeting, I don't know how many times the CNO said, you're prioritizing to the highest needs within your school. This is the school's chance. This is what they do. The school has to prioritize the needs of the highest needs, or whatever. I can't remember, paraphrasing here a little bit. But essentially, when you hear that, people go, oh yeah, you have to prioritize the highest needs all the time. What that means is you're saying which children aren't getting a service. It's not that the children who don't have the highest needs don't have any needs. We have, I think they've calculated, and I think the Department of Education have said, 25% of children in primary schools have additional needs. And we are not able, with the hours that we get and that NEPs are given and that any of these places are given, you're not given an allocation to cover all 25% of these children. So what you're basically covering is probably maybe 10%. I don't know, I'm putting a random figure on it. So 15% of children get nothing by prioritizing to the highest need. So I guess that's what I'm talking about. Well, the NEPs do the same thing when they come in. You have to prioritize to the highest needs within the school. So the highest needs are children that are out of school. So that's children who are on shortened days. Now you're talking in that context, you're talking about less than 2% of children, far less than 2% of children in any school. And that's who the priority are. You're also looking at children who who aren't getting resources because they don't have an assessment. So there's, the department will say, oh, people don't need assessments for anything anymore. But if you want to go into a special class for autism in a secondary school, you can't get that without a full assessment. So you've got hundreds and hundreds of children every year who have to have a reassessment from NEPs or privately, but mainly from NEPs, to say that they are allowed to go to an autism class in a secondary school. So you're looking at, but by the time they get to that, you can forget about any other service. And that's not good enough. It's not good. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about unaccountability, because no one can say that there's no waiting list, essentially, is what I think this comes from. And whether it's on the verge of collapse, now I argue it's already collapsed. Collapsed a while ago. NEPS is one, and I've argued this in the podcast, you can listen back. The NEPS is the one good service we had left in the education system for children with additional needs. If you were lucky enough to have a NEPS service, you could be guaranteed to get a very good assessment of where you're at. They give good advice. And I'm very fond of NEPS as an organisation. The trouble is, there isn't enough of them at all. And unfortunately, as a result of that, they're now being asked to do more for less. And they can't do that. So they're doing all these pilots, they're doing all these consultations, they're doing all these things like passing on, like they're getting involved in literacy schemes now for some reason. And they're getting involved in all sorts of areas. But they're not able to do their core work because there aren't enough of them. This is the problem. And what I was saying on the media is that if you went to another country, so and I know everyone says, oh, Finland's different. It's not really. If you go to Spain, even, I had a member of staff who went to Valencia. Most schools have access and good access to a psychologist a social worker and a nurse on site. There isn't very many primary schools that have a social worker, a psychologist, and a nurse on site. And the thing is, a lot of people that are working in these organizations, do you know where they're working? They're working in offices away from children. If you ask the NCSE, for example, they have this service where they come in and they give you, if you have children you have a child that you're not able to work with, because not that you're not able to work with, they're just unable to manage themselves. They could be violent, they could be, and you just don't know what to do. You can ring the NCSE for an advisor. Now that advisor comes to your school, but they will not see that child. They are not allowed to look at that child. If you do one of those pilots they've been doing where they're bringing in speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, and they come and advise the schools on how to deal with occupational therapy and speech and language therapy, and guess what? They don't see the children. This is the kind of stuff. It's madness. And what we need is a system where all schools have on-site access to psychologist, a social worker, and a nurse. And if you had these services in schools, you wouldn't have the problems that we have. We have to wait until children are in absolute crisis mode before we actually see them. The funny thing after this article was, and I knew this always happens in Ireland, okay? Basically, some NEPS psychologist has sounded the alarm to privately, they're a whistleblowing for want of a better word. I was wrong to see if this is true. I'm now basically talking about I talk about actually how I get a decent service in comparison to most schools based on the status of my school. But funnily enough, what happened, and I don't find it humorous at all, it's sad, is that rather than NEP psychologists coming on board and saying, yeah, what Simon's saying here is probably right, is I had someone on Twitter, lovely guy, I presume, I don't know, I've never met him, basically saying, we work hard, we're really proud of the work we do, and this thing that we're unaccountable and we don't, and it's on the verge to collapse. This is what I did. And you're like, no, this isn't personal. This isn't about you. I know every NEP psychologist I know does a good job. In fact, most people I know working in education work really hard. We just don't have the level of service we all need. That's the problem. It's not that the service itself is bad, because the service itself is really good when you get it. But the problem is we don't get it. And then I keep moving on, like he was saying, like I help 56 children in a week. But the thing was, maybe, but what happened after you left? What new thing happened? No kick-in service was there. Those 56, I don't know who the 56 children were, but I can nearly guarantee you that they didn't get anything that actually helped them. They might have got some advice. They might have got a little bit of time, but we didn't sort out the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is our health services is fallen to pieces. There is no mental health supports for children. There's no occupational therapy. There's no speech and language therapy. There's no dietitians. There's no, give you the CDNT, I can't remember, that's collapsed. It just doesn't exist. You have all these services that don't exist, and everything is falling back on overloaded services like NEPs, who can only do so much, rather than basically saying, this is the reality of the situation. I even heard, I won't mention any names, that a friend of mine was basically saying, oh, I heard you were on the radio about NEPs. My friend's a NEP psychologist and she's not happy with you. And it's like, don't shoot the messenger. I don't know. The fact is, if NEPs as a service is great, if it was supported better, it's not. I treat the education system very similarly to I'm going to do, if you're watching me on YouTube, basically all these services are like in this kind of rising tide of who, and essentially NEPs is now in that thing. They're sinking and sinking and sinking, and we're just sinking all the time, and everything is falling back on parents and families and schools, and people are just they can't do the work they need to do, so they just try and fire it off on someone else. We've seen it in every other service. The EWO, for example, back in my day when I started, if a child missed 20 days, I was on the radio about this actually as well on our RT drive time, that basically if a child missed 20 days, I'd ring up my EWO and I'd say, oi, we've got someone here missing 20 days. She'd take over and ring the family and say, why are you doing missing 20 days? They don't have enough people. So what happened was it was thrown back to school to do all that stuff. And it's only when something's in a chronic state, because an absolute crisis, that the EWO comes in. You can see, I suppose what I'm saying is everything is sinking and sinking. The Department of Education if they put as much effort into solving the problems as they do to spin doctoring, we'd be doing a hell of a lot of good. But anyway, I could go on about this for long, for ages and ages, and it would do no good. So let's move on to story number 2, which is school transport. Yes, the Minister for Education, not learning from her past foibles or mistakes of expanding the school transport system without making sure they did enough buses and enough bus drivers, is further expanding the service. And this time, she's making sure that over 100,000 more pupils are going to be able to access the service because they're scrapping some of the rules, which are you don't have to go to your nearest school. The bus doesn't bring you to your nearest school anymore if you don't want it to. And, something around the distances from schools. I think it's more for secondary schools than primary schools. But I could be wrong on that. But the thing is, why aren't children going to their nearest school? And the answer to that question, of course, is tied up in patronage. I don't send my kid to his nearest school because if I did, I would have to unteach him a lot of what he's been taught in school because it would be faith formation. And I don't want him to go to, I would prefer him to go to his nearest school because he would be within his community. I am sick of the fact that when he goes to his local football club or his local swimming club or whatever it might be, he doesn't really know that many kids there because he has to go to a different school because I just don't want him to be, indoctrinated into a religion that we don't buy into. And this is where it's funny how bus transport and even insurance ties into this. I go on about this in previous episodes of the podcast, and I don't want to go on about it too much. But the reason bus transport is so convoluted is because children are not going to their nearest school. We also have far too many schools, so we have far too many buses. And if we simplified the system, it would be so much easier. My kid, my kid go on a bus in the morning and go to his nearest school. And he would be brought back home after that, along with his neighbours and all the rest of it. And if we just re-examine the way we do bus transport, but we can't do that until we re-examine patronage. And ultimately, the answer is very simple. We have to look at patronage and all the stuff that it does to complicate the system. Because when we have this idea of school choice and have that choice along religious lines in the main, it's not going to work. We have to make sure that schools are welcome to all children, not just, and I know schools will say, oh, no, Simon, all children. I've loads of Muslim kids in my school. I've loads of blah, 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 atheists in my school. And so I get that. I know they're welcome to a point. We've taken down the baptism barrier, but we've simply moved it under the mat in the thing. Because what happens is when you welcome those children in school, that's very much, they're nice, they're able to come into the school. When it comes to you teaching your religion, they sit at the back of the class. That's not welcome. That's fully welcome. And I see all this thing now. I love looking at comments that principals make in the media, if they do, or on Twitter or wherever it might be. And I love the new thing now isn't to say that we're an inclusive school. I'm noticing now that people are saying we're a very inclusive school. Very inclusive. Well, I find that very interesting. Why do they have to use the word very there? It seems like thou protest too much all the time. And I'm not blaming the schools. But what I'm saying is we have to look at the patronage system so that we can actually then examine how bus transport is going to work. Otherwise, you have this weirdly unwielding system where buses are passing each other in towns to go to totally different schools unnecessarily. I'm in a school where there's 11 buses serving our school. It's madness. It's mad. And the reason there's so many is because we're the only multi-denominational school in the entire county. The children should be going to their nearest school. My kid should be going to his nearest school, but they can't because of this patronage system, which basically doesn't allow for it to happen. So what I'll be saying, and the only thing I'll be saying, instead of expanding the service, I think the minister needs to be looking at why we have such a convoluted bus service and how we actually can fix that by fixing the human rights of all children. It's as simple as that, really. I don't think there's any much more to say on it. Let's move on to Irish exemptions. Yes, schools with high rates of Irish exemptions are now going to be audited by the Department of Education because, and let me tell you, I put this down as a story on Twitter, which seemed to get a bit of a reaction and people thought it was quite funny, despite it being a bit mad, really. So basically, a number of years ago, if you wanted to get an Irish exemption, you had to have a psychological assessment, going back to NEPS being overwhelmed. So because it's overwhelmed, NEPS said, well, no, I don't know if NEPS said it, but basically NEPS couldn't basically do these assessments just for Irish exemptions. So the suggestion was made that school principals would be thrown back onto schools, as most things are, and schools would be able to give Irish exemptions. And we were given clear rules. And those rules that children would have to fail in a reading or spelling test and be under the 10th percentile in a standardized test. And there was a couple of rules about ages and whether you were the son or daughter of someone in a consulate, no less. But most children who fell under either were through age or through under 10 percentile in the tests. And it's very easy, in fairness, to fall under the 10th percentile in a reading or spelling test. If you're a child whose parent tells you, whatever you don't try in the test, get all the answers wrong. And now I don't think that happened because people are not like that, of course. But anyway, a lot of children do fall under the 10th percentile in a single reading or spelling test. And that makes them eligible for being exempt. However, that wasn't enough for some families, because some families argued that Irish is traumatic experience for their children. So they argued that it was too hard for their child to get an Irish exemption. So we then had to prove that over a period of time, I think 2 years, that Irish is causing undue stress to children. And that would make them eligible for an Irish exemption. On the other side, the Gaelgori mainly, or maybe people who are fond of the Irish language and defending of the Irish language, are arguing it's too easy to get an Irish exemption. So they argued that that they needed to change all that too. But the Department of Education listened to the people who said it was too hard, and they put in this new rule. Fast forward a couple of years, and lots and lots of children are getting exemptions from Irish. And the people who were saying it was too easy are back saying, we need to scrap this whole exemption thing. It's wrong. We need to stop it. So the Department of Education went to them and said, oh yeah, I know what we'll do. But blame the schools. They're given far too many Irish exemptions, and therefore they're going to be audited now. And do you know what's going to happen? To be frank, what's going to happen is schools aren't going to be audited. And if they are audited anyway, we'll show them, look, we did all this, tick, 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 tick. We'll have ticked all the boxes, and they'll come back with a report saying, yeah, the schools are doing what they're saying. The Gaelgori will be grumbling again, and who knows. But essentially, in summary, all those awful schools fought for granting all those Irish exemptions. I don't know. So there we go. Finally, I have lots and lots of stories that I look at every couple of weeks, and I save them onto my Feedly form. This week, if you subscribe to the newsletter, you'll find that I have been scouring Britain and the US for stories, and I've shared them in the newsletter. But I also looked at my local county, County Kilkenny, had a visit from the Minister for Education, Norma Foley, who turned the sods on 3 different schools. She visited 4. 3 of them got some turn sodding, and had a visit where she spoke to all the children. And it's always very nice to be visited by the Minister for Education. I get that. You have to make a bit of a thing. I get there's politics at play and all the rest of it, and you have to be kind and nice and do all these dances and all the rest of it. And I'm sure she was treated very well in the Kilkenny schools. What I'm more interested in is the fact that when she turns the sod and those schools are built, guess who's going to own those schools, despite the Department of Education funding them for millions. This will be millions of euro and cash being spent by the state, and those buildings will be nicely gifted to the churches that where the schools sit. And of course, we move on to County Meath, where there is a school, Lismullen National School, has been waiting 17 years for the minister to gift their school, rebuild their school, and give it to their church. I don't know if it's a Church of Ireland school. It's funny, it looks like one, but it may not be. I actually don't know. And anyway, it doesn't really matter, because whatever the religion, because I'm not all about the Catholic Church here, it's any religious body or any private body that owns a building. I find it really distasteful that when the state funds these buildings, that the state no longer owns after such a huge amount of investment. But that is the system that we have. Anyway, I could go on about that for ages, but I am running out of time. We're coming up to the half-hour mark, and I try to make these new episodes less than half an hour long. As I said, if you are interested in any further of those news stories, I've loads of them that I've found on everything from children in the UK having to wait a whole year. Hundreds of children in the UK are waiting a whole year for psychological assessments. Oh my gosh, wait till if they came over here, what they'd see. And there's some really nice, there's a really cool article, I love it, written by the secret teacher. I think it's in the Irish Times, it might be the Irish Times or the Irish Examiner, where they talk about a parent who said, this my child has got the worst teacher in the school. They'll never get higher level, whatever it is. It's a secondary school story, but it's brilliant because it's written from the parent's perspective and then absolutely torn to pieces by the school and the child themselves and the teacher. It's a very good article. It's actually worth subscribing to my newsletter for that news art alone. I also go through a number of tweets that I thought were really good, very useful for you, and really good analysis in certain areas. And also, if you want, I do an ICT, a tech tip every 2 weeks. And this time I'm looking at sending electronic newsletters and the options that are available. So have a look at that if you want. You can find that by going to anseo.net/subscribe if you haven't done so already. And I publish those in about a week after the podcast published. So if you aren't a subscriber. Anyway, enough from me. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks so much for listening. We'll chat to you again very soon. All the very best. Bye-bye.